So we have 4 different arrangements, and what we're going to do is just go over a few different ways in order to make composition the most effective. Composition can be referred to as the layout, the design. By definition, it is the arrangement of parts. For example, in your room or your house right now that you're sitting in watching this, looking around, you'll notice different things are arranged in a certain way based on how you wanted them to be. That's the best example of composition. So let's apply this to drawing. I am going to be drawing in red. That way you can see me. So for this first one, we have 4 dots, and we're going to start off by going over something called the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is a photography term, and if you were to take your pencil or viewfinder and drop a grid, a tic-tac-toe grid on it, the rule of thirds divides it into 3 even sections, and it advocates for putting the focal point and information on one of these intersections in the center square that I just drew. So what that means is that instead of taking those 4 dots and putting them in the middle, what I would do is something like this, which I did before. I moved my dots, 3 on the left side and then 1 on the right side. So that's the rule of thirds. And then also, if you notice, this dot right here is, I don't like this pencil. This dot over here is by itself, so that is the focal point. So in terms of composition, rule of thirds, because I have placed those dots right here and here, and then composition because, and then focal point because this one is by itself, which means that it gives it more weight, right? It's 3 versus 1. You're starting to question, think about some sort of story or narrative, perhaps. So that's the first one, rule of thirds and focal point. Those are the main 2 that we're going to really focus on. For the second one, I have these squares right here. So it looks pretty boring and static. What I did briefly is I moved them in a way where I took the triangles and I inverted them. So instead of having a triangle like this and like this, that's boring. You can have triangles going on diagonals, which are much more interesting, as you can see. So without overloading us, the golden ratio is found a lot in nature, and you can look up online more about it if you'd like to, but the golden ratio is really about movement. So rotating the images and putting the shapes or focal points in some sort of way along this line could also help with movement. So those are 2 different ways. I know I'm putting the golden ratio and rotating together, but you can use them individually as well as the rule of thirds and focal point. So all 4 of these so far are independent of one another. I've just chosen to put them together. So the third one, which is down here, has the same shapes except we have the rectangle that we've included. So to increase perspective and try to play around with this without changing the size, what I did is I did 2 things. I moved the circles so they were on top of the triangle, right? Move the circles on top of the triangle, and I also made the circles go off the page. So cropping, that's off the page, and overlapping, which is putting shapes on top of each other, because we do know that this is going on. However, we just cannot see it. So it's a more effective way of showing or composing things by putting them on top of each other, which leads us to our last point, is it's a little landscape here. So I have one that I did, but for this, I would actually like you to take rule of thirds, focal point, crop, and overlap. So just the 4, and see what you can do with this picture. So take those 4 ideas, see if you can rearrange them to illustrate those points. Something to keep in mind is that you want to avoid, really quickly, you want to avoid 2 things. You want to avoid putting a bird, let's say over here. If I were to leave this image like this would be not good. That's called isolation, and that's bad. Another thing is if you were to put a mountain here and then draw, let's say, a telephone pole, right? That's also bad because of the way that they're kissing. We call this tangent, right? They're tangentially touching each other. You can more effectively overlap them. That would be better, right? Or simply move them apart. So those are the 2 things to avoid while you're doing this. If you want to go back and review the concepts, but take these shapes and think about rule of thirds, focal point, crop, and overlap as you do this last square, okay?